So I suspect that a lot of this person's problems are not due to the low IQ. This is not what's dooming them. They are doomed, but what they're doomed by is their belief of their own success or their inability to become successful. My IQ is below average. What are some of the ways I can live a successful and meaningful life? Hello, Dr. K. I'm a young adult male and I'm currently going through an existential crisis where I believe that I am not going to make it in life. I don't have any skills or talents that makes me unique in the direction of my life is going to a complete disaster. The direction of my life is going to a complete disaster and nothing can be done. I'm in college studying business that can't get me anywhere. I'm still living with my parents because I don't have stable income to survive on. I can't do basic tasks such as using the cash register at work, folding clothes, sweeping, and cleaning my house. There's so many tasks that I can't do right. I can't pay attention in my college classes. I take longer to understand things more than others, and I struggle to think fast. It's horrible because my parents constantly put me down and compare me to my peers who are doctors, lawyers, and software engineers, making far more than I do. The huge issue that's affecting me is my low IQ. I took an IQ test when I was in school by the psychologist, and I scored around 80, which is exactly below average. After this, the psychologist even felt pity for me and told me to my face that I won't amount to anything in life. I swear to God that I am probably the dumbest to walk this earth. I am extremely unsure of how I will survive in this world, as that if your IQ is below 87, you can't work any type of job to survive. This seems embarrassing because it's difficult when I want to move out. When I want to move out my parents' house, I'm not financially stable to do it. I get depressed every day knowing that I can't prove myself to others. My dreams of being a physicist or an investment banker, please don't laugh, are not going to happen because of this curse. I was thinking about jumping off a building one day because I can't take this shit anymore. So, the first point, right, is if you're really considering, if you're having thoughts of hurting yourself or jumping off of a building, you may want to actually seek professional help, right? So like this is something, and we'll talk about why that may be particularly important for this person. So what we're going to actually do is take a step back and look at, let's talk about a couple things, okay? So we're going to talk about IQ, we're going to talk about this person's situation, and we're going to talk a little bit about if your IQ is below average, can you have a successful and meaningful life? Spoiler alert, my answer is going to be yes. But it is my job to convince you of that, right? I'm not necessarily correct. It may not be possible. So let's just try to be as objective as we can and kind of think through it. Okay? So let's start with this. What is a successful and meaningful life? How do we define that? Right? So that's the first question, is like, what is a successful and meaningful life? Can anyone give me an answer? What do y'all think? How do you determine what a success? I don't know. Right? So, okay, so like people are sort of saying, like, let's just think through this, right? So if your goal is to have a successful and meaningful life, which I have no, I think that's wonderful that you want that. Let's first start by like understanding what it is that you're shooting towards. Okay? So let's think about it. Okay, what is... Right? So like, I don't know. So people are saying income. Okay. Being productive. Being happy. And so this is kind of interesting, but like having your needs met. Excellent. Right? So this all like is good. Fulfillment. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call an audible here. And I'm going to move this one up here because then like the next question is like, what is fulfillment, right? Chat? It's like, what does that even mean? So now the next question is, so if you want to determine whether you can have a successful or meaningful life, the next thing that we need to do is sort of try to figure out what are the things that correlate with this, right? So then the next question is, does IQ somehow correlate with these things? Okay? So like, I think we can clearly say that probably like IQ and income is going to be like correlated. But I don't know that IQ and productivity, happy, or getting your needs met is necessarily correlated. Maybe because of this, we can also say that needs met in terms of financial. So maybe your financial needs can be met this way. But once again, so I say this as a psychiatrist who's worked with many, many people who are like very narcissistic and very successful, i.e. investment bankers. I can pretty much tell you that, like, you know, sure, they have the income and they may be sort of productive, but they certainly don't feel that way oftentimes. They work a lot, but they don't really feel productive because all they're doing is editing PowerPoints. I kid you not. Like, their job is like, okay, they get a PowerPoint at midnight and their partner says, hey, I need this by 6 a.m. Make these changes. So they spend 6 hours running models, making these changes to a 35 slide deck. And they make the changes and they send it out to the whole team. The other partner on the team says, hey, these changes are bad. I need you to make these changes. I need you to revert back to what we had before. And so like, it's just like constantly editing slide decks to meet the preferences and whims of a particular person. So I certainly will attest to the fact that many of them are not happy. They don't feel fulfilled. They don't have meaning. They certainly have income, but they pay the price of fulfillment, success, meaning, and happiness. That's what they pay for money, right? So that's what they get money, and then they don't have those other things. So I'm not really sure that, you know, aside from income, IQ is necessarily correlated with like other things. So that's the first thing. So you may not be screwed in life just because you have a low IQ. Now let's kind of also kind of look at things a little bit more objectively and sort of try to understand, okay, like what's up with IQ? So here's what we need to understand about IQ. So the median IQ is about 100. And one standard deviation, which is about 70% of people, are between 85 and 115. So one standard deviation is about 15. So this is where most people live. Below 85, we start to get to, you know, there's about 15% that are less than this, and 15% over here that are greater than this, right? And so 80 is like right over here. And so even if you're below average on IQ, it doesn't mean that you're like devastatingly screwed. So that, you know, the number at which we really kind of think about intellectual disability is actually like below 70. So once you cross 70, because remember, one standard deviation is 15, right? So a second standard deviation is 70. So this is where you start to get into the mild intellectual disability range. And this is where you may not really be able to, for example, be a physicist. I don't know if someone with a IQ of less than 70 can be a physicist. I just don't know. I'm not saying that they can't. But in this 70 to 85 range, I personally don't think that this person is quite as screwed as they think they are. So you can still like hold a normal job. It may take you longer to learn particular things. There are lots of different jobs where you don't necessarily need to have a high IQ to be successful. And so let's kind of flip back to the post for a second and take a look at, you know, what's going on here. So I suspect that a lot of this person's problems are not due to the low IQ. This is not what's dooming them. They are doomed, but what they're doomed by is their belief of their own success or their inability to become successful. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about this. So like this person has a problem of, if you read this post, it can be summarized with this statement: I will fail. Okay, so let's just kind of look through this for a second. So I'm currently going through an existential crisis where I believe I am not going to make it in life. Okay, that's the first thing they say. Not going to make it. Okay, and then I don't have any skills or talents. No skills or talents. So they believe this, right? The direction of my life is complete disaster. And I'm in college studying business that can't get me anywhere, not going anywhere. Right? And then I want to fast forward. So they're, you know, they talk about all the things that they have difficulty doing. Okay, so can't perform basic tasks, can't do basics. Parents constantly put me down. Okay. And then can't prove myself. So we're going to jump. There's the IQ paragraph and then can't prove myself. So we're going to analyze what this person is saying, okay? And then we're going to talk about dreams. So these are the things that I want y'all to take away, okay? So they're not going to make it. They have no skills or talents. Their life is a complete disaster. They're not going anywhere. They can't do basic tasks. Their parents constantly put them down. You can't prove yourself, and you have particular dreams. So you may say like, wow, that sounds kind of rough. So here are the points, right? So this is what is in the post. And now we're going to kind of examine it. So our examination is going to be here. So it starts with this idea that I will fail. Okay? Now this is really important because the I will fail idea affects us in two ways. So one is it creates something called a nocebo effect. So we're going to talk a little bit about psychology and science. So there is something called the placebo effect, which is that if someone believes that a medication will work, it is more likely to work. So you can even give someone who's got like diabetes, let's say a sugar pill, the irony. And the irony is that if they believe that the medication will lower their blood sugar, even though it's a sugar pill, if they believe it'll lower their blood sugar, it actually lowers their blood sugar some. That's called the placebo effect. Now, at the opposite end of the placebo effect is called the nocebo effect. And I see this a lot in psychiatry. So sometimes I'll get people who come into my office and they'll say, medication has never worked for me. Medication does not work. So they're coming into my office with a nocebo effect. And even the thought that medication never works for me is going to actually affect the efficacy of medication. So if you go through your life thinking you will fail, there's actually scientific data to back this up. It's not just like a psychological thing. It's like it's even like a neuroscientific thing, right? So this is important to understand that this works for physical medicines. So forget about psychology for a second. We're talking about diabetes levels, cholesterol levels, response to chemotherapy and cancer treatment, that the nocebo effect is actually active in all divisions of medicine. So it's not just psychological, it's physiological. So what this sort of means is that you actually, if you believe you're going to fail, you are actually more likely to fail. And I don't just mean psychologically. It's not like, oh, I believe I'm going to fail, therefore I'm not going to try as hard, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not talking about the psychological stuff. I mean like physiologically, your body is prepped to try to create failure. So second thing, and this is going to be a little bit more psychological or neuroscientific, has to do with our success calculation. So our brain has this circuit that performs success calculations. So it basically performs this calculation that sort of determines motivation and behavior. Okay, so let me give you guys an example. So this morning, I did not wake up, go out to my garage, grab a shovel, and start digging for buried treasure. Why did I not do that? Because my brain performed a calculation that was like, hey, by the way, if you dig for buried treasure, you're probably not going to find it, so there's no point in trying. Okay? Now, we also see this kind of motivational stuff happen with people who have difficulty with dating. So people who believe that they're going to be alone forever will be not motivated to date, or it'll be very difficult for them to date because their brain is literally making a calculation that is like likelihood of success is like a big part of the calculation. And so if your likelihood of success is very, very low because you believe you will fail, then your motivation is going to like be very, very low. Okay? So now what we sort of get is like a sort of a vicious cycle, okay? Where I will fail, we've got the nocebo effect, success calculation is low, decreased motivation. Therefore, these two things are going to kind of combine and result in a higher percent. It's a percent sign, just poorly drawn. Let me try to draw it again. An increased percentage of failure, right? And so the more we fail, the more we get evidence that I will fail. And the stronger this gets, this forms a feedback loop, goes over here. This becomes stronger. This becomes stronger. This becomes stronger. Motivation motivation actually goes down. So let's actually do this, right? Motivation decreases. And then these things in turn are going to increase our chance of failure, which will in turn increase the evidence that I will fail, which will then go back around and feed into this. Okay? And this is how we see. Now I want you guys to look at all these statements. Where do you think these statements came from? Well, actually, let's stop here for a second. Okay? Where did these statements come from? These statements come from going through this cycle over and over and over again. It has nothing to do with IQ. So like IQ may actually result in a greater chance, having a lower IQ may have something to do with a greater chance of failure. But this degree of certainty about failure, right? So if you had a confident person with low IQ, and I've met with those people, I know people like that, like I have friends like that. You know, they just sort of like understand the limits of their ability, but they are actually like sort of chilling in life, right? They're kind of chilling. They're like, they have their job. They're not actually super ambitious, or sometimes they actually are super ambitious and can be very, very good at stuff. So for example, I have a friend who's a chef who probably has like a below average IQ. They've been tested as well. We're going to talk about testing in a second. But you know, so they tested below average, and they just went to culinary school, and they're doing fine in life. They're actually like pretty ambitious. They're pretty productive. They're not happy, but for reasons that I think are unrelated to their IQ or their professional success. So there are a lot of professions out there that don't require a high IQ, that you can also still be like very reliable, very successful. I think that there are a lot of positions that people with higher IQ may find boring, that people with lower IQ may be better suited for. So there may be a certain amount of like, you know, day in and day out kind of stuff, that like organizing stuff, like those kinds of things, jobs like being a personal assistant. There's a lot of stuff out there that people with low IQ may be better suited towards. Now, let's remember that this person wants to be a physicist or an investment banker. So we don't want to alter their dreams based on, hey, you can't be a physicist or an investment banker. You need to be a personal assistant or a chef. Like, we don't want to say that to this person. That's not what I'm saying. Although I suspect that based on their attitude, they're interpreting things that way. So like, let's look at this. After this, the psychologist even felt pity for me and told me to my face that I won't amount to anything in life. I highly, highly, highly doubt this statement. The psychologist would have to be the worst psychologist on the planet to tell you to your face that I won't amount to anything. Hey, you're not going to amount to anything in life. They may have said, hey, it may be hard for you to become an investment banker or physicist. They may have said something like that. But given this attitude, what the psychologist said may be interpreted in this way. Given your attitude, you may have even interpreted what I said as, hey, you can never become a physicist or an investment banker, which I didn't say that. Right? You may be a great physicist or investment banker. I don't know. Let's finish kind of analyzing this, okay? So these statements come from this cycle. And the question is, okay, so like if this is a cycle, where does it start? Here's where it starts. Right? So if your parents, because this is the thing, I don't think they just started comparing you to people who are doctors and lawyers like just over the last year. Chances are, as you were growing up, your parents started by putting you down a lot. They made lots of comparisons. They sort of didn't accept you for who you are and wanted you to be something else. So as parents, parental comparison is where the cycle starts. Hate to blame the parents. So this is just a hypothesis. Maybe your parents were wonderful. Who knows? I'm not saying they aren't wonderful, but if they compare you a lot, this is where the kind of cycle starts, right? Because what they're always doing, no matter how hard you succeed with parental comparison, let's look at it this way, okay? So they say, why can't you, okay, so they'll say, here's you, here's someone else. So why did you get a C? Someone else got a B, right? Why can't you be like this person? This person gets B's. If you get a B, why didn't you get an A? Right? Why are you studying business? This person is pre-med. You're a doctor. Why didn't you go to Harvard? Right? If you go to Harvard, why the fuck are you becoming a psychiatrist? Right? It's such a waste of your talents. You're too smart to be a psychiatrist. You should do something that's more competitive, like cardiology. My point is that IQ doesn't really determine this. It's the parental comparison. Right? So the parental comparison is where this starts. And no matter what you accomplish, they're always comparing you to someone better. It doesn't really matter how good you are, right? Like, it doesn't matter. If parents are going to compare, if they're not going to accept you for who you are, like, they're going to compare you. And then the conclusion from all of this is you're not good enough. And then it's a very short hop, skip, and a jump to you will fail. And thus the cycle begins. Okay? So this is the kind of thing where I think that what's holding this person back is not actually their IQ, although I'm not disputing that, I don't know that like someone with an 80 IQ, I don't know their ability to become a physicist. I just don't know. But what I do think may be very, very possible is, for example, if you love physics and like you understand physics, like let's say that, how can I say this? Sometimes the worst students make the best teachers. So like, if it's hard for you to understand things and you can get to that place of understanding, you may actually be a far better teacher than someone with a very high IQ. And the reason for that is because people with the high IQ they can skip all the middle steps. But if you've got a low IQ, you may learn things slower, but you learn all the middle steps, and you may actually be a better teacher. So I know it sounds kind of weird, but like the reason that I'm really good at teaching motivation and understanding motivation is because I suck at it. Like my internal motivational drive is very, very low. And oddly enough, that's actually like an advantage in a bizarre situation. Right? Because like now I understand, like I couldn't take motivation for granted. It wasn't easy for me. It was so hard all the time. And so that's what actually makes me like an effective teacher on motivation, because I can't take any of it for granted. I'm just assuming for a moment that I'm an effective teacher on motivation, which I may not be. So the last thing that I want to point out is the statement of can't prove myself. So if you want to understand what leads you to being fulfilled and meaning, if you're trying to prove yourself to other people, this is never going to happen. So if you want to understand, like, okay, how do you become successful? Here's what it is. You start by understanding, okay, like, here's my IQ, totally fine. You understand what are the things outside of my IQ that are holding me back, because it's not just IQ. Right? It's this belief that you're going to fail. To understand, okay, this belief came from somewhere. So this is something that you may want to work with a therapist, right? Not only for the suicidality, but also like for this kind of stuff. Like, I'm not saying go to a therapist just so you don't kill yourself. I'm saying go to a therapist because, first of all, suicide is scary and you shouldn't kill yourself. And the reason you shouldn't kill yourself is because I don't agree with this premise. And a therapist can help you change this. They can help you do this. And then suddenly all of this changes, right? Then you're harnessing placebo instead of nocebo. And then suddenly, like, things that even have no biological effect are starting to work for you. So you can absolutely do that. The other thing that I just want to point out is IQ tests. I don't know exactly what the reliability of the IQ test is, but if you're at 80 and you got tested once, you need to be a little bit careful, because I do believe that IQ tests are affected or confounded by different things like mood or, stuff like depression. So depending on when you took it, there may be like things that negatively impact the reliability of the IQ test. So I also don't know like what the reliability between two tests is. So for example, like, tests just have different reliability. So if you get tested twice, you may discover that you're actually like 90 the second time, right? There's probably some amount of like movement in terms of reliability. Now, generally speaking, IQ tests should control for things like age or like level of education. I think they try to control for those things, but there may be confounding variables. So I don't know how to say this, but like an IQ test is not like a biopsy, right? It's a test that tries to approximate your intelligence. The last thing is that IQ tests don't really look at EQ. So there are some people that I know, for example, that are like average or even below average IQ, but are actually super high in the EQ domain. And this could be you never know. And if you're high in the EQ domain, you can actually be very, very successful and offer a lot of value to places. So a good example of this is kind of interesting, but if you look at investment banking, the people who are actually at the top, I think, have an EQ greater than IQ situation. So the people who have the highest IQ are the ones that are best at running models, creating models, doing a lot of like the technical work. But actually, if you want to really succeed at the highest levels of investment banking, it's about relationships and relationship building. It's about bringing the business in the door. So IQ is necessary for executing the business. EQ is necessary for bringing the business in the door. Okay, so you may not be screwed. Last thing is that, I'd say that if you're thinking about the dreams, right? So this person dreams of being a physicist or an investment banker, which is totally fine. You're allowed to have your dreams, but I would be really curious, like I'm telling you to be curious about where that dream comes from. What is it like? Because like, what do you know about investment banking or being a physicist? Why does that appeal to you? Why is that your dream? And chances are you have a particular vision of what that looks like, which may not actually be a physicist or investment banker. But once you understand what appeals to you about the investment banker or being a physicist, you may be able to duplicate or satisfy those needs in an alternate profession. So a lot of people will have fantasies of like, oh, I want to be this because if I am this, then I will be happy. But what they're really chasing is what they think that thing is. So we see this a lot in terms of like relationships too, where sometimes you'll have like a vision of a person and you'll be like, oh, I really want to love that. I want to be dating that person, but you don't really know who that person is. And reality is very different from what fantasy you create in your mind. So it's okay to have dreams. I'm not saying abandon your dreams because you tested low on your IQ. By all means, go for it. Like if you want to study business, like study business and then apply for a job in an investment bank. By all means, go for it. But I'd also like encourage you to be curious about what does it mean to you to be in investment banking? What is the kind of, how would that fulfill you? And once you understand what that need is, you may be able to fulfill it outside of investment banking, which is how you get meaning and fulfillment.